Hey everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Today we'll be doing kind of a book discussion of a little book from the 60s that has been a subject of renewed interest lately by Father Jean Danielou. I think he was a father at that point, not a cardinal yet. It's called Prayer as a Political Problem, and it's recently been reprinted by Cluny Media, a publisher I've called attention to before on this show. And it was published in 1967 originally, in English, I should say, the English translation. Jean Danielou was a Jesuit theologian and patrologist. He lived from 1905 to 1974. And he was emeritus at Vatican II and eventually became a cardinal, reluctantly. So I thought it would be interesting to discuss this book with a previous guest on this podcast because it sort of dovetails with some of the things that he's written about. I'm talking about Brandon McGinley, who was previously on here to discuss his book, The Prodigal Church. More recently, he co-authored with Scott Hahn, It Is Right and Just, Why the Future of Civilization Depends on True Religion, which I haven't read, but I've heard good things about. And actually, my dad wrote a blurb for it, now that I think of it.
That's true.
And you know what? I'm pretty sure that it'll be able to be tied in easily here if Brandon wants to do so, within reason, within good taste and reason. So we're just here, a couple of freaks sitting up at 10 p.m. discussing a book. Welcome back to the show, Brandon.
Hey, thanks for having me, Thomas.
So this was kind of an interesting read. I saw it in the Cluny catalog. They have all sorts of really interesting kind of mid-20th century Catholic works that they republish. And I asked the publisher, John Emmett Clark, to send me a copy of this along with a book by Maritain called The Primacy of the Spiritual, which I had a hunch that they would work together, that would work well as to be able to discuss them together. I think my hunch was wrong. They're kind of looking at different things, and they're very different sorts of books. But I decided to go with this one, not because I prefer it. I actually like the Maritain book a lot better as a text. But this book is really, I think, will be a good jumping off point for conversation on a number of topics. In many ways, the book feels like a preface. It's surprisingly light reading. He kind of raises a bunch of questions, but doesn't kind of give really dense answers to them in the text. Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, I agree. And I get whiplash, honestly, reading the book, because there are many things that I'm reading and I am thinking, this is 1967, 1960s, like you said. There are many things I'm reading where I'm feeling like this is ahead of its time. There are times where I'm reading, I feel like it's before its time. There are arguments that are being made that are going against the flow of things of that era. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of the book, I feel like, wow, I could peg this to the 1960s.
Absolutely. And sometimes you have to read a little more closely because sometimes he sounds, downright progressive, and then you read it closely, and I'm not sure he means what he sounds like he means here.
I agree.
But yeah, it's an interesting book for sure. And I want to thank John Emmett Clark, who runs Cluny Media, for not only for sending me this book, but for earlier today when we kind of had an emergency and needed a quick PDF copy. Yeah. He got right on that and sent it to me immediately. I was really hoping he would be at his desk when I sent that email, and he was. Thank God for that. Yeah. So great publisher. I'm sure that I'll be covering more of their work on here. And I had him on the show actually at one point. So I'll link to that episode in the show notes if people want to learn more about their work. So the basic idea of this book, I mean, Prayer as a Political Problem, it almost feels like it should be titled Prayer as a Political Problem and Other Essays, because, you know what I mean? They're all sort of around a similar theme, but he kind of departs from that specific topic after chapter 2, and it goes all over the place. He's talking about art.
Yeah, that chapter 2 would name Prayer as a Political Problem is kind of the core, but it's, I mean, I almost imagine that he or someone who in his publishing house gave the book that title because it was the snappiest, not necessarily because it was the key text for the book.
Yeah. Well, a lot of I think a central problem for the book is this development of what he calls a technical or a technological civilization, and the problems, and of course, along with rising levels of atheism and kind of materialism going along with that, and the problems it poses for religious life, and specifically religious life as part of the natural common good,
right?
Which is kind of something which is, I think, one of the reasons that the book is both before its time and ahead of its time, at a time when this is very much coming back to the fore. Now, unlike kind of the I'm going to use this word loosely, the kind of integralist movement and Catholic thought right now, he's focused on religion primarily as a natural good, whereas they're talking about, what Maritain was talking about in his book, The Primacy of the Spiritual. But he's talking about prayer as what he describes as a constitutive element of the common good, which is an interesting, just a provocative thing to say in itself, because even as Catholics, we might say, hold on a second, aren't we in danger of kind of reducing prayer to like an instrumental end? That's what many Catholics would be, concerned about in reading this.
Yeah.
But that can be something, a problem that you need to get beyond, I think.
Yeah. I think that some of the definitions that he's working with are not what you are expecting when you open up the book. Certainly the definition of religion is one that is frankly not the one that the Catechism works with. I mean,
absolutely. I completely agree with you.
Yeah, it's the modern definition with some, that's a little bit unfair. I mean, I think the modern definition of religion is basically kind of any spiritual feeling. I think that or any kind of supernatural belief system. I mean,
he's definitely talking about rights. He is talking about rights.
Yeah. And he's talking about religion as he's talking about religion as a sociological phenomenon, and as kind of an anthropological phenomenon, which is one of the things that's very much of its era, I think. And and as one that is essential, but again, not in the way that I think the church has traditionally defined it as essential. I know you had told me ahead of time that you found that the religion and Revelation chapter problematic, and I thought that was the most confounding chapter, because on the one hand, the definition of religion he's working with and the way he's talking about religion is not appealing at all, and sounds for a minute almost indifferentist, and specifically,
and you get this in the first chapter. This is actually in chapter 1.
You get it early too, and then he gets into it. But the weird thing is he draws this distinction between religion and revelation. That religion is kind of something that everybody does, unless they've been disenchanted by technological society. But basically everybody's a pagan, and everybody's doing something like religion. Like I said, unless he doesn't say disenchanted, but it sounds almost Chestertonian, where he's talking about how technological society has
desacralized.
Exactly. Yeah. Desacralized. Exactly. Yeah. So it's like the sun is no longer the source of light in this kind of a spiritual, psychological sense, but the sun is just a nuclear reaction that's happening in space. Yeah, I mean that, but I was thrown off by the way he describes, like I said, basically that in that the religious sense in the way that anybody goes about it, if there's basically any kind of a sacred feeling, even and especially the ones he describes as pagan, are basically good and are basically a step on the way to the finalization, the fulfillment of that feeling in revelation, which is distinct. So
religion to him is man's construction of his man's turn towards God, and revelation is God's turn towards man.
Right. Yeah, it's just kind of for me, I mean, I'm no expert, so this may be more common than I realized, but for me it was kind of a bespoke definition that I had never really come across before, and I'm not sure how helpful it is, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm not crazy about it either, but we can come back to that.
Sure.
Let's talk about kind of the central. The way he opens the book is interesting because it's the same way that you open your book, The Prodigal Church, actually, which is to talk about this idea of a purer, smaller church. You were referencing the kind of misquoted Benedict, the 16th address, which I will mention that famous quote from him. We actually recorded that in our other podcast, Catholic Culture audiobooks.
Well, it's important to note too, because that was 1970 and this is the mid 60s, and you can see they're both operating in Europe. They're both operating in kind of a similar milieu and coming to some different conclusions, actually, which is interesting.
Yeah. So basically, the first chapter of this book is something like a church for the poor. And the problem that he's dealing with is this problem of having a religion that is accessible to the masses at whatever level that they're going to engage with it, essentially. Not that he thinks that it doesn't need to be kind of fully personalized and spiritualized, but he thinks that he references the legalization of Christianity with Constantine, and this new problem that Augustine had to deal with. I think Augustine talks about I don't remember the Latin, but he basically talks about there's now three categories. There's the really good, the really bad, and the neither wholly good nor wholly bad. And these are the mass of Christians who are now able to enter into the church because it no longer requires heroism simply to bear the name of Christian. And some people, many people have bemoaned this and said that it introduced all kinds of corruptions into the Christian religion. This is a very common Protestant narrative, for example. Danielou says that this is good, actually, as they say on Twitter, and that it is not corruption, but that having the masses be able to engage even on a somewhat surface level, on what he calls a sociological level, that's a good thing because A, religion is a natural good, and B, because religion is a natural good and it's the sort of thing that people do, it is good that the sort of thing people do, even if it's only to express their sort of natural need for religion, be the true religion. And then that's something that you can build on. And then that's something that, the pastors of the church can work on and deepen.
And for me, that central conceit of the book, which is responding to, I think, some movements at the time within the church to contemn that kind of association between the church and civilization, as he would put it, or the church and civil society, to kind of enforce this separation. The church is wholly spiritual and so on. And that, for me, is that central conceit is exactly right. And the idea that the church does not need civilization in the sense that the church needs civilization to exist, but the church needs civilization. The church needs, I would say, a culture, cultural Catholicism, to use the phrase that now has a bad connotation. He would call it sociological Catholicism or sociological Christianity. It's only when that becomes detached from the spiritual that it becomes potentially corrosive. But the fact of the matter is that for there to be the kind of church where the average person can feel at home and to grow in holiness, there needs to be a culture around it that's keeping them attached to it. It can't just be, and this was very prescient in the book, cannot just be a church of intellectuals. And this is something that we see today very often, where we praise, rightfully so, in a sense, rightfully so, the disproportionately intellectual nature of converts to the church. We say, it just shows how, because we're fighting against a kind of a secular culture that wants to say that Christianity is backwards and stupid and all that. We're like, but look at all these smarty pants who are joining the church, reading the Substance of the Church, reading St. John Henry Newman, reading Augustine, so on and so forth. great, but that's not the ideal situation. The ideal situation is that you have a culture, a civilization that is enforcing these norms and making it so that the average grandmother is going to mass and praying her beads, and that's all she has to know, really. And
I think that he talks about that we don't want to leave behind the masses for whom Christianity is barely more than an outward routine. The routine is something you build on rather than get rid of. And that also connects to his concept of religion in general, because he says it's not a victory for, he says that some people seem to think that atheism prepares the way for true religion by getting rid of the pagan religions and all of those, the impulses to sacralize, creation. And we can talk about that more later, but so he to quote him related to what you were saying, he says, before the faith can be truly rooted in a country, it must penetrate its civilization and bring into existence a Christendom. I would add, to some extent, to one extent or another.
Yes.
So he says, so basically, this kind of leads him to another aspect that I think makes him a little bit against the current of his time, which is that he says having the masses in the church is ideal, but it can't happen if the church isn't involved in civilization. It's not desirable that the church's temporal influence be reduced to a minimum. It's the situation of the early Christians where they are very pure but marginalized is actually not the ideal situation for the church.
And I think we could learn from that situation now. We can realizing, and here's where I think you can actually combine, the Danielou insight and the Ratzinger insight from 1970s, that, Ratzinger, despite what was often said about his remarks in 1970, was not praising the idea of a smaller and more spiritual church. He was saying it's going to happen whether we like it or not. Basically, it's up to us to deal with that reality. Whereas Danielou, a few years earlier, is still holding out hope that that there can be this kind of re-Christianization, a re-establishment of a kind of Christendom, but very importantly, not a backwards-looking one that is responsive to the modern era. And so he goes out of his way to say what is good about technological society and all of that. And so the question then for us today is, you look at the situation and you have to. Danielou talks about the signs of the times. It was all the rage in the 1960s. Well, what are the signs of the times in the 2020s? It's that our situation is closer in many respects to the early church than to certainly the Constantinian church. The question then is, how do you respond to that reality while at the same time remembering that the ideal situation, the situation we're called to try to bring about, is Christian civilization. It's not to just sit here and be happy being the Christian elite who have made it through, who have decided to continue to be Catholics in this age. How do you take that and not get back to in the sense of the past, but get back to in the sense of creating a civilization again in the 21st century?
And the goal is not to create Christian. The goal is not to create Christian civilization as an object, but it is to save the maximum number of souls, and that's what he's about here.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
And to make it as easy as possible for people to live a Christian life.
Right. Yes, and that's something that and I say this just because it's on my mind and because I wrote about it, not to plug the book, but when we talked about the prodigal church. That's something I was very, very important to me to come to at the end of the book, which say the point of creating of Catholic communities and neighborhoods and so on is to try to create a new Catholic culture so that the next generation doesn't have to feel like they have to actively choose at the age of 18 or 16 or whatever the case may be to follow this weird sect that is and to do it on their own in most cases. But to actually create the kind of culture, even in microcosm, where it's natural. It's where the faith is passed down like DNA.
Yeah, and exactly, and not to have to discovered tradition in books, which is kind of oxymoronic.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, this is, I mean, we don't have to get into all this, but there's a weird and kind of paradoxical aspect to any kind of traditionalism in a secular age, in a deracinated age like ours, because any kind of traditionalism is a forensic task. You're bringing back to life a Frankenstein, and it's very it's something that just has to be grappled with. But that's neither here nor there with regard to Danielou. So we'll get back to that.
Sure. Yeah. So getting back to, the idea that prayer is a constitutive part of the temporal order, of a complete temporal order of the temporal common good. He says at the outset that he's not mainly in this book talking about prayer in a specifically Christian sense. So he is focusing on what you would call the natural virtue of religion, and of a kind of religious outlook, in general, a sacral outlook towards things.
I prefer saying that than religious, because religion has a specific definition. It's the virtue by which we do justice to God, and that is that doesn't really fly with paganism. I think that he confuses the virtue of religion with how that virtue is applied or misapplied. Yeah.
In specific cultural contexts.
Yeah. I'm willing to say that in a cultural context where Christianity is not a live option, then to live your life in accordance with the truth as is understood in the prevailing way in even the kind of supernatural truth as understood in the prevailing way in your civilization, in your society, insofar as it does not contradict the natural law in terms of like child sacrifice or something like that, then there's that I suppose is in a very imperfect way an instantiation of the virtue of religion, but I think he elevates that with far too few qualifications.
So let's pretend he's talking about Christian prayer here.
Yes.
And we can come back to this. I think we'll come back again later. We've already touched on it a few times, but this discussion of religion in general. But in what way would you say that prayer forms a part of the temporal common good?
Yeah.
It's obvious how it forms a part of the spiritual common good.
Yeah.
But is there a way in which prayer in itself forms a part of the temporal common good, as opposed to the effects that it may have, the kind of good it may do?
Yeah. When I first heard about the book, I'm going to answer your question, but when I first heard about the book, the first thought I had was that it was going to be about how the efficacy of prayer in the temporal order presents a political problem, which I think it does, but that's not what he's talking about.
Sure.
But the the prayer is part of the temporal common good in Danielou's telling, and this is correct, and we're going to isolate it to Christian prayer for the purposes of this particular discussion, because it's part of being human. It's part of a fully realized human life, and also, and might not be precisely how he'd put it, but I think that the conditions that lead to prayer are themselves also good. Having time to oneself, having time of contemplation, time for quiet, time to, and this is a very 60s language, but it's not wrong, to develop one's personality, to develop the completeness of one's humanity. And this is part of
that's his definition of the common good, essentially.
In this very 20th century, but it's not a great definition of the common good, but I think it's part of the common good, because if we understand the common good correctly, we understand that the individual good of each of us is not undermined or subsumed in the common good, such that our individual good doesn't matter, but it is our individual good elevates everyone else's, and that in turn, not in an additive sense, but that is part of and constitutes in part the common good of everyone. And so so there's some, it's partially there. In the language of the common good, of course, we want to hear it, we want to see it, we want to apply it. It just needs to be done rightly. And I think it's certainly correct that prayer is part of the temporal common good. And also, and he doesn't, his focus, and I don't think this is because he denies what I'm about to say, it's just because his focus wasn't there, but corporate prayer is certainly part of the common good. Liturgy is part of the common good. Corpus Christi is coming up. Processions, public communal prayer is part of the common good.
My parish is doing a Eucharistic procession here in Manhattan because it's got two churches, two church buildings. So between one and the other, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, I love that kind of, especially when you can do a place to place, and it's. I mean, hey, doing it just around your building, around the block, whatever, it's great. I mean, but that kind of place to place is real procession, a pilgrimage is really lovely. Yeah.
So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I'm the one who brought up Corpus Christi. But so I think, the prayers and whether you isolate it to his analysis or expand it, prayer is certainly part of the temporal common good, which presents problems for secularism, obviously, which is part of the point of the book, maybe one of the essential points of the book.
I think it might also present problems for us. Just going off the cuff here, it might also present problems for a certain kind of certain misconstrual of the distinction between nature and grace, perhaps because I think that this goes back to the problem of what is religion. Well, man, it's true that religion is a natural virtue, but as soon as you get into the application of that, without Christianity, you get into real problems. It practically becomes a vice, almost immediately.
Exactly. Yeah.
Unless you're a Neoplatonist or something.
Yeah.
But even then,
yes.
So you get into huge problems where it's like man does need Christianity to even fulfill his natural good.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, that's the point of my book with Scott Hahn, honestly, is that, the virtue of religion is not just an individual virtue, but as we were just talking about with corporate prayer, is a corporate communal virtue, a public virtue, and it is a virtue that is part of justice, is an aspect of justice, a specific kind of justice, a kind of transcendent justice by which we, in our own puny human way, do justice to God for all that he has given us by giving the very best that we can. What is the very best that we can? It is worship, sacrifice. And if you don't get that horizontal axis of justice right, kind of classical, kind of cruciform way of thinking about it, if you don't get the vertical axis right, the horizontal axis of commutative and distributive justice in the temporal order, that is the essential purpose of civil authority, has nothing to stand on. And so Danielou's getting at this in a very different way, and is not taking it to the conclusions that Scott and I do, but certainly the idea that religion is essential to the temporal order, to it functioning well, to justice reigning, is there. He's just defining things differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he identifies a few things as kind of practical problems that, not really specific ones, but kind of general practical problems that the civilization needs to address in terms of prayer as part of the common good. So you mentioned the time needed for formal prayer.
Yeah.
I don't know that I see that as our biggest problem. I think that most people probably in the West probably have time for, a daily rosary, for example. But he also talks about the need for solitude, time for solitude in general, personal time, the time to develop your personality without, being constantly pressed on by others and by noise.
Cell phones.
Yeah, exactly.
For those who are just listening, I waved my phone in front of the camera. I mean, that's
thank you.
That's a classic.
Yeah.
It's a classic example, and I think it even goes to the time thing. We have time. There's no question you can make time, and one of the great paradoxes of making time for prayer is that the more time you make for it, the more time there ends up being, and that hasn't always been quite as true for me as people say it is, but it definitely happens. And once you get used to it, it's like, oh, I'm not actually missing that time. What was I doing during that time? It's the same thing with having kids. Like, what was I doing when we had 0 kids or 1, 2, 3, 4 kids? I don't know what I was doing with all the time that I had. You get used to it. You get used to giving time to God. And at the same time, remembering that the original thesis is that we're trying to make the faith and religious practice as accessible to as many people as possible. And so constant distraction takes away time. Even if you have the free will to put it aside, it's still making it harder. And we also have to remember that if we're talking about a church for the poor, he's talking about not just the poor in terms of material poverty, but in terms of just kind of the average person and the masses. Yeah. But the poor do generally have less time on their hands. Certainly the poor who are working multiple jobs, who kind of like the working class, the whatever. We don't need to get into the various distinctions, and they aren't really particularly relevant. The point is that when political economy is making you work 40, 60, 65, 70 hours a week just to make ends meet, or in the case of those who are working those hours to make lots more money, to make it feel like you're making ends meet, we have a problem.
Yeah. The other big thing he brings up is the desacralization of culture by technical civilization, which makes it almost impossible, he says, for most men to pray. So he doesn't quite say it's impossible for people to pray, the average person to pray under adverse circumstances, but he's talking about kind of the level of heroism that's required to live a Christian life, and that it's actually good that it require less heroism.
Yes.
So were you going to say something?
No. I think he's exactly right. It's just that insight hits differently in 2021 than even 1967. Because then he could still hold out hope that in the near term, might seem silly to us now, but at the time there's a lot of optimism in this book. That's very immediately post-conciliar. Oh, we can still work with modernity, and that feels very different now. And so, there's this real conflict that as I'm reading the book where I'm like, we need to get back to that. And the idea of a church just for the kind of spiritual and often because of the time thing and the intellectual thing, the spiritual and a kind of like intellectual economic elite, that cannot be the end game. And yet, we have to also grapple with, how do we deal with the situation we have now, which is increasingly that one? Yeah.
So he really he's really good on kind of the necessity of Christianity engaging in civilization. I mean, he says that you can't identify Christianity with Christian civilization, but that it's among the totality of things that have to be restored in Christ. So we have an obligation to restore civilization in Christ. It might not be our most immediate goal, but it is among our obligations. And I think that's a very strong point. And this would be almost a really I think if it were not for his weird definition of religion, this would be an even more like based book.
Yes.
Than it is. So let me. By the way, did you catch this weird thing? It's at the end of chapter 2. So he says that if religions demand of the state that it make a life of prayer possible, the state may demand of religions, I'm not quoting him yet, the state may demand of religions that they make it a reality. And he says that churches which are just sociological remnants of earlier historical periods with no real inner life anymore, he says, quote, the state can rightly consider these dead wood and legitimately cut them out. And I don't know what he means by that. I think he might just mean that the state is no longer kind of like actively fostering these churches and kind of like subsidizing them or what. But it's a kind of a really alarming
yes bit. That's one of the parts that feels the most quasi-indifferentist, where it's, and also
like, he's already said he says at some point that the state doesn't even have the competence to determine what the true church is.
Right.
So that it would have the competence to determine what is, rigid and calcified versus.
Well, if he's this is where that kind of very immanentizing aspect of the way he's defining religion, and he's focusing on the temporal common good because that's his point, but he focuses on it so much that he gets to the point like there where if religion is not fulfilling, if a church, he often talks about the churches, but if a religion is not fulfilling its duty basically to the temporal common good, then the state whose purview is the temporal common good can take action against it. And that's where it's one thing to say we're focusing on the temporal common good for the purposes of this discussion. It's another thing to inadvertently, maybe, reduce religion to an aspect of the temporal common good, because that's where you once you've lost, if you cut out the idea of the sacral order, of the supernatural order over which the church has authority on, to the extent that it's related to affairs here, then that's where you end up. That deadwood churches should just be burned out by the state, but that suggests to me a real loss of the vision of what of the supernatural and of authority in the supernatural, which belongs to the church.
Yeah, one thing you can't call it is really a Vatican II vision.
Yeah,
you can't call it like a Leonine vision or a Vatican II vision necessarily. What I'd like to do is we can probably focus full on this religion issue now. I'd like to look at chapter 6. Yeah. And then you the chapter on religion revelation, and then use that to go back and look at some of the stuff he says in chapter 1 about his odd conception of religious freedom that he has.
Yes.
So in chapter 6, I'm just going to read a quote from early in the chapter. He says, the religion of a people is so much a part of its heritage that a man could no more betray his religion than betray his race. Religions are part of the richness of creation. How could Christianity destroy them when its mission is not to destroy but to fulfill when it comes to save all that has been created? Now, he's been quite clear that the pagan religions are man-made.
Yes.
And that they need to be purified. They are subject to a lot of corruption and distortions, but still it's quite odd. Again, I think he's confusing the virtue of religion with like the cults that actually exist.
Yeah.
And he calls religions part of the richness of creation, and that we have to save all that has been created. I don't know that it's our job to save all that man has created. I could be wrong, but they're certainly not all part of God's creation.
There are things that God has allowed to happen that we don't that are not going to be fulfilled in grace.
I think many of the works of man will simply perish.
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, it kind of goes to he talks about how religions create civilizations, and how Christendom, of course, is created by Christianity, by the church, but how all these other civilizations have also been created by... He's reifying these cultures into... I mean, he actually he snaps back and forth between praising and condemning nationalism, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And I think because he wants to say that ultimately this will all be fulfilled in the universal church. He's getting there, but that in a way, and this is the part that's kind of charming, and I think it's right that every culture is going to instantiate that differently, and that's really lovely, and I think it's exactly right. I think he goes too far when he says that basically that the East Asians were right to reject Christianity because it was presented to them in a Western way.
Yes, he says that Western Christianity. He says what they are rightly rejecting is not Christianity, but its Western form because it destroys their cultural values. But I mean,
I don't know exactly how to draw these distinctions.
Understandable, perhaps, but not right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't. There's a distinction between I think I haven't put enough thought into it to be able to put it in precise vocabulary, but there's a distinction I think between what I'm saying, which is that Christianity will look different in different cultural contexts. That's what we mean by inculturation when we're doing it right and not just using it as an excuse to do whatever we want liturgically. But that doesn't mean that these cultures are so radically different that he's almost sounds like, and in fact, on his definition of religion, he might actually be compelled to say that it's different religions, that the Christianity that ends up being fulfilled on this layered on top of Hinduism, that is like the fulfillment of the religious sense that comes out of Hinduism, is a different religion, again, in this bespoke definition of religion, from the Christianity that was fulfilled out of Greco-Roman mythology, or that was fulfilled.
Because he even talks about like how Christians are still pagan in some sense. Like his definition of pagan is the man-made expressions of the natural, like, so he thinks that if it's just reduced to kind of like the level of popular devotion or ritual, even like the cult of the saints and different things like that would be pagan. He's operating on a completely different definition of the word.
I love to do that kind of thing. I love, people are like, oh, Christmas is actually Saturnalia or whatever. I'm like, great. We love taking things over and co-opting them and turning them into.
That's an example that he gives is the building feast upon the date of.
And I think a lot of that's overblown anyway. So I think they're just trying to get us with that. But the point, like even if we built it on top of a pagan feast, all the better. I mean, that's what we do. We co-opt. And when the church is at her best, when she's a confident culture-making force, when grace is when she is mediating grace to not just individuals but to families and entire civilizations, and we are just rolling on all cylinders, we are co-opting entire cultures and turning them to Christ. That's great. And I completely and to the extent that that's what he's saying that we should be doing everywhere, I'm completely on board. But he's really leaning into the kind of supernatural reality of these man-made pagan religions that in a way that is taking it beyond to the point where it's helpful for me.
I mean, do Hindu converts to Catholicism need their own liturgical calendar based on their previous Hindu feasts or something?
Right, exactly. And that's it gets into very sticky questions, actually, the more we talk about it, because on the other hand, I mean, you don't want, it gets into very sticky questions of colonialism and to what extent Western Christian, because on his telling, it's almost like a decolonial vision before its time, where like the only way that Christianity can be authentic in these places is if it is de-Westernized. And this is, I was thinking of, I think, the not correct but also very interesting point, or aphorism of, I believe it was Belloc, that the West is the church and the church is the West, or the West is Christianity and vice versa. It's not, it's overdetermined, but the faith as it developed culturally and spiritually through the ages is a European thing. And so that,
well, I mean, so Danielou, he kind of,
with, but I don't think he's grappling with it in the right way.
He kind of almost looks at it as though we are still converted pagans in the West, that we are still Greco-Roman or whatever, Anglo-Saxon converted pagans, as that, though, that this civilization is still an expression of that, as opposed to, like, well, certainly that there's a lot of truth to that, but it's also that Christianity has formed the West into what it is. And so by that very nature, do we need to reinvent the wheel for every culture that becomes Christian? Right,
exactly. And that, and there's also, I think this,
by the way, they want one thing he notices is that these Muslim students in other countries want Western technological culture, and so by the same token, other cultures, they want classical music, they want jazz, they want it's pretty common that they want Western things in every other area of culture. So I think that it's different when it comes to imposing like Latin liturgy on the Eastern Christians or something like that.
Yeah, he actually almost says, I think he almost says decolonial or something like that, where how you said, you had the quote earlier about how I think the quote I'm thinking of is a slightly different one, where he says that it comes to be seen as a kind conversion comes to be seen as treason in colonial places, because it is a kind of treason against the ancient culture, against the pre-colonial culture that is trying to throw off the Western influence.
And that's certainly true in especially in, at least at the very least, in especially in high civilizations, like India, China, Japan. That's where it's most visible, where you see the most resistance.
Yeah, and like I think it's certainly a true observation, but at the same time, I guess I don't really know what we are to do with it.
I mean, the old man does have to die.
Yeah.
So now, but that's the problem is, you don't want to get to the point where you're like the worst example would be what's in the news right now in Canada, right? With the schools for Indian children. And I think an old slogan of those schools was, kill the Indian, save the man, or something like that. Which is a real problem. Yes. Right.
Yeah.
So,
well, this is where you get. It's so interesting. This is where this has taken us, but it is all very much implied in the text. He just doesn't get into it, but where we talk about like civilization is good. Civilization, like to create a society where more people, and this is where you talk about technology being good, where more people can survive and thrive, and where technology allows that is good. But you can't, and this goes both to the question of the use of technology today, and it goes to the question of kind of the, imagine me in air quotes, this kind of civilizing mission of American, colonialism. And I don't mean, when I say air quotes, I shouldn't mean that I'm completely dismissing the idea, but if you take it too far, it gets to the point, like you said, of killing off a civilization and its people. It's so interesting. The more I think about it, the more it's actually deeply postmodern, this idea that he's dealing with, where he's coming at it from this way of describing religion that is very weird, but he's getting at a profound respect for non-Western civilizations that is very new and is and there's a lot to be said for, but he's doing it through the basis of religion, precisely the thing that is most problematic about these civilizations.
Yeah, that's well put. He also does this thing where he equates the philosophy of the pagans, like he mentions Confucius and Plato.
Right.
He conflates pagan philosophy with pagan religion. And I think that it's precisely a lot of what we took from the Greeks and Romans was precisely their, not all cultures have been philosophical cultures.
Yeah.
Not all cultures have had philosophy as distinct from religion.
Yeah.
No doubt Plato was a pagan, but he also said things that were somewhat subversive of, the paganism of the day, and that sort of transcended it. So I think it's important. We shouldn't. I think that we shouldn't assume that he seems to be implicitly operating on this whole seeds of the word kind of idea from like Justin Martyr, and I think that we shouldn't assume that those are equally present. In other words, he thinks that every culture is fulfilled, every religion is fulfilled in Christianity, almost like in the way that Judaism is fulfilled in Christianity, or in the way that some of the ancient Christians thought that Greek philosophy was a precursor for Christianity. But those are, and there's some truth to that, but those are very specific, very providential. Providence is always at work, but those are moments of heightened providence. And those two examples in particular, the Hebrews and the Greeks, that we can't assume is present in the same way in every culture.
I mean, you only have to look to a place like Japan, which has proven, nearly impervious. Clearly there are cultures that are more or less ready, they're more or less kind of the philosophical, spiritual underpinnings that make it a place where the faith can more or less easily take root. I think kind of getting to what I stumbled into before when I was talking about kind of other non-Western civilizations, I would like to say, I think it's true. I think it is absolutely true that every civilization, every culture is ultimately fulfilled in the faith. That's ultimately what the diversity of cultures must be ordered to. But that he sees these all as being constituted by religions, and that is where the fulfillment will come through, as if any kind of sacred feeling, any kind of supernatural intuition is putting you on the road or putting you on the right path. And it seems to me that that's just not the case, that there are many examples of supernatural intuitions, sacred cultures that are quite the opposite, that leave you in a far worse position vis-a-vis the being evangelized. And that, it's a confounding way of going about it that leaves me, it's just I just think there has to be, I know there are better ways of getting to his end point, which is Christianity needs civilization, and civilization needs Christianity.
And it's clear that he believes Christianity is the only, true religion, so to speak. Yeah. Or the only true revelation, to use his terms.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And that distinction is so, I think it just confuses a lot more than it illuminates.
So I referred to this passage earlier, which I want to quote now. He says, People see the destruction of religion as a condition of the faith and fight against the pagan elements which live on in Christianity. They think that when atheism destroys religion, it opens a way for faith. So again, he's talking about that, that the sort of like exporting of Western materialistic liberalism is not necessarily the most conducive kind of like midpoint to Christian evangelization. But you can't have it both ways. If you're going to acknowledge kind of the sacralization of culture and the meaningfulness of that, I think that you have to acknowledge the presence of the demonic.
Yes.
And
we've been dancing around that the whole time.
He has this line: the fathers of the church were not entirely wrong when they saw their devilish forces at work to turn towards themselves the natural movement of men's hearts toward God. Well, yeah, that's nice of you to say, they weren't entirely wrong. Of course they weren't. Right. They weren't wrong. Right. That's what St. Paul says. He says that the sacrifices of, to idols are offered to demons. Yes. So, there's this really, really cool podcast. Have you heard of Lord of Spirits?
No, I haven't.
It's a podcast. It's an Orthodox podcast. It's on the Ancient Faith radio network, and it's hosted by two Orthodox priests. And somebody turned me on to this episode titled "The Land of Giants," and I have to say it's like one of the best podcast episodes ever made, in my opinion. It's like 3 hours about the Nephilim, basically, and how they're like way more important to the whole Old Testament narrative than people realize. And a lot of, but the reason I'm bringing it up is that a lot of it is about their project on this podcast is about taking the stuff that even modern Christians dismiss, like the Nephilim, or like the fact that the Old Testament refers to gods that God is greater than, as though they're real beings.
Right. Yes.
Things like that. Taking those things seriously. And so, I think that if you're going to fight this desacralization, then it has to go both ways. I think that you're going to get then into a more primordial conflict between Christianity and these other religions. Rather than Christianity just purifying them. I think you're going to get into something a lot more fundamentally conflicting than the kind of moral conflicts that he may, acknowledge.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that, and here I think we're definitely some of it. I mean, some of this was, I think obviously it's correct in any time, but I think a lot of this is the distinction between talking about this in 2021 and talking about it in 1967. The book is shot through with a great deal of temporal optimism, which is nice to read for a change, but hasn't really panned out. And I think that as the desacralization has continued apace, and as, in fairness to Danielou, he says that a lot of the things that he's saying could be good about modern civilization, about modern technology, and so on, could become a new barbarism. That I think has proven much more prescient than the optimism. And
you almost feel like he's talking about prime matter in most of this book. You know what I'm saying? So he will say things like, basically we have to embrace technological progress and all this stuff, and then he'll say, but like that doesn't mean it's going to be good. Yeah. It's like he's talking about like in principle and kind of on the basis of basis of like an abstraction. Yeah. Almost.
Yeah. And I think that's something that comes out of that era, which was, on the one hand, talking a lot about the concrete. He's very, very clear. We need to be talking about the concrete situation that we're in right now, while at the same time, not fully appreciating just how far things had already gone by that point. And so there's just that I don't think he talks about the danger of a lot of things the danger of the church becoming a church of the intellectual, the danger of technology, in a kind of that is without reference to God, without reference to revelation, without the religious sense generally, becoming a new barbarism. And well, I'll get to that in a sec. As if the die hadn't already been cast, as if we weren't already on that road. And the most naive, frankly, parts of the book are where he talks about, and this is so 1960s, so Vatican Council era, that we're coming to human beings generally are coming to a new understanding of our oneness, of what we share, and that the church, we can capitalize on this. That there's a kind of a spiritual movement in the air towards brotherhood. Yeah. And I'm just maybe in 1967 it looked like that, but I don't even think I think even in 1967 you had to be smoking something to. But I do come back to this optimism of the mid-century, and I do still find it very hard to understand how people could have thought that even at the time. I mean, especially once you're, hey, it's hard in the American context, and the European context is also different. I think. I guess post-war France, 1968 is a watershed moment. He hadn't gotten there yet. I guess there seemed to be a Catholic revival in post-war France. Yeah, wasn't there? I'm not. Wasn't there some sign of that? It may have been. I don't. But thing is that 1967 isn't post-war. 1967. That's. I mean, it's post-war, but it's not. Right. I think of post-war as being like 65 into the 50s. But once you get into the mid to late 60s. I think you got to shake that off, but right. But I mean, but this is a thing for the church to this day. I mean, I have a lot, and I have written very kind things about Fratelli Tutti, but Fratelli Tutti is still trying to get back to this moment. It's still trying to get back to the early European Union, the idea that we can respect everybody's cultural differences, but also all get along, and that we can all do it in a secular sphere, in a secular frame. These brainworms are still tooling around in Vatican brains. And and I don't, and like I said, Fratelli Tutti is a beautiful document, and there's a lot to be said about it, a lot of good to be said about it. But the frustrating thing is that it's clearly like, and there's and the best thing to say about it is that there was a lot of good in that era. There was a lot of good in the unifying movements that were happening, especially in Europe, and we should try to find that good and try to bring the good aspects of the fraternity and the toleration and the genuinely big-hearted liberalism that was open to faith of that I want to believe was there. We should want to find that good and to rekindle it, but. Mm-hmm. This is 2021. And so how we go about that is very, very different from how you go about that in the 1950s. And I think how you go about it, I have to think how you see it in 1967 has to be different from how you see it in 1947. But, maybe I'm missing something. Hey, I wasn't alive, so I don't want to besmirch the good Jean Danielou, who maybe saw things that were genuinely gave him, a real reason for optimism that we are blind to because it didn't turn out. Right. Well, the prophets of doom, turned out to be right, it seems. Let's go back to chapter 1 and his really odd notion of religious freedom. So he's talked a bit about, the necessity of faith penetrating civilization. He talks about religious freedom and he says,
basically religious freedom to him seems to include like the guarantee of a religion operating, as opposed to sort of like non-interference. So he specifically talks about really, you know, how the form religious freedom would take in a capitalist state would be more kind of like that, like, you know, business and stuff would like sort of take care of it.
Foundations. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, but then he says, well, now we're heading towards a socialist state, and he sort of takes this for granted. It doesn't criticize it. We're heading towards a socialist state.
It's very of its time. It's also very European.
Yeah, we're heading towards a socialist state, and therefore religions simply won't exist unless they get support from the state. And therefore religious freedom requires the state supporting all religions actively. He says, it is not to be supposed that the civil authority has competence of itself to decide upon the truth or otherwise of a religion, so that the state must simply support religions in general. He says that religious freedom requires religions to be given whatever is necessary for their continuance and development. And I will say that is, you know, for the most part, I think he's steered clear of like actual sort of doctrinal error here. Just kind of weird definitions and weird frameworks. But that actually is directly contrary to Leo the 13th, for example. And Leo the 13th is very clear. I did a whole episode on Immortale Dei, that the state is not just obligated to support religion in general as sort of a generic good, but specific, and it can't treat them as all on equal ground, and that it does have the obligation to profess the true religion and support it. And he's very clear. Leo even says it's not hard to find out what the true religion is. Now, I don't know that that's a doctrinal statement. That might just be a practical sort of assessment, but it's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. It's not a question of competence. If human beings are competent to do it, then so are human authorities. So that's a real problem. I don't know what else we can say about it. But
I thought it was bizarre. I mean, I don't. I think that it's so weird because you have, on the one hand, a kind of American style no preference regime that he's sketching out, but a completely opposite, completely, you know, the converse, the inverse of the American style, with support for every, so that, and I think you said this, but I want to stress it, not just so that religions can do what they do, but so that they can build themselves up and thrive, and all of them equally. And I think that there's a kind of, we could call it optimism, we can call it naivete, he distinguishes specifically this from state atheism. State atheism or laicite or secularism are out of the question. But this is good. And I think it's optimistic or naive to think there is a difference in practice between state secularism and state non-differentiation.
Well, that's what Leo says.
Right, exactly, yeah. So I just don't... And I think that besides the theoretical, I mean, it's just been proven. It's just been shown time and time again. And I don't... Yeah, it's just very... it's very weird. It's very weird.
You know, you mentioned what he says about nationalism. There's a passage in here that I really like, in chapter 4, which is one of those moments where you say, okay, this guy just isn't just a straightforward progressive of his time, you know? Let me see. Because it's right after he says the part you just mentioned, where he says there's this collective conscience and respect for human dignity and freedom. It is true that this can be overthrown on occasion by political forces, he says, but et cetera, et cetera. So he says, Let's see. These values of the collective conscience have a real influence on the development of humanity, but the element of vitality and power also plays a part. It would be an illusion, for example, to believe that the forces of nationalism are destined to diminish. Quite the contrary. The world of today shows an even greater consciousness than ever of nationality, and this is a creative and constructive element of the humanity of tomorrow. That turn of phrase is a little progressive in itself.
The humanity of tomorrow. I think it's also a translation from French, and so I don't know exactly what their idioms are. So.
Sure. So let me skip ahead a little bit here. He says, is it not remarkable how, just when it might be thought that the world could be unified through technology, the way to unity is blocked by the awakening of new nationalisms? It seems to me that these forces are a healthy protection for humanity against the threat of a technological civilization which could lead mankind to a collective uniformity where originality and the values of feeling and imagination which express the spirit of peoples could be thrown away.
Now
that's very interesting, and that kind of duality he has is a little bit, Pope Francis like as well.
Yes.
Although in practice, I think Pope Francis tends to side with the globalists. But he says he does say in his statements both.
Right.
Both things.
In Francis, and this is actually a real connection here, does have a real emphasis on the importance of individual cultures. See this in Fratelli Tutti, and he also attacks rootlessness, which is very interesting. Says that basically that kind of international finance forces, whatever, global forces, one of the ways that they entrench their power is to especially going after children and making them forget or contemn their roots, to pull them up so that they are more, so they're better kind of, citizens of the global financial order, for lack of a better term. And I think that you can see that in this. Now, on the other hand, of course, Francis is extremely suspicious of new nationalism and populism specifically as a force. And so this is a tension, I think, in Francis, where he's in some ways has a deeply traditional view of the way of the importance of culture to identity, because if you don't have that, then you're going to form identity through consumerism and through internet fighting, which he talks specifically about in Fratelli Tutti. But at the same time, he clearly is profoundly suspicious of those who would reify that in a political order right now. Whereas in what you see in what you just read from Danielou is fascinating, because that for me was one of those prescient things in the entire text and could have come straight out of today.
Yeah,
certainly he obviously didn't have the internet, but that's what he's basically describing. And who could disagree that that's precisely what's happened, especially in the countries that have, we could quibble about the details of how they've fought back, but especially these Eastern European countries, obviously Poland and Hungary come to mind, who are trying to not only reassert their distinctiveness, but also assert national sovereignty over the kinds of quote unifying technological forces that have had in practice really just been forces for A, kind of like American neocolonialism, and B, a kind of deracinated global order.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You were talking about how in practice there might be not any difference between state atheism and state indifferentism. Yeah. And I think you could say a similar thing here. Perhaps we could posit that in practice there might not be that much difference between, being a globalist and thinking that every culture is equally kind of primed and prepped for Christianization. Because the fact is, I mean, I would need to spend more time thinking about how to flesh that out, but we could simply point to the power of Western technological materialist civilization to corrode and deracinate these cultures, which is happening everywhere. Although some are adapting it in interesting ways and making it their own in interesting ways. That, it may be that you need a Christian culture to resist those currents. In other words, like I don't know that an animist culture is going to hold out. Right. When Western technology and prosperity finally makes its way to that corner of the world, I don't know that it's going to have the wherewithal to hold out in the way that a really robust Christian culture would be able to.
Yeah, I mean, do we have any good examples of robust Christian cultures holding out? That's the thing I think about. I mean, we have pockets, but I mean, not to be too dark, but I mean,
I think probably more in terms of politics than in terms of technology per se.
Yeah.
I think that there are some cultures that are trying to hold out politically, but I don't know that, any of them. I mean, you can look at the fact that, it's been pointed out that, Hungary has, more porn stars per capita than any other country in the world. So in terms of culture and technology, maybe not as much, but I think maybe in terms of political globalism, to some extent. Perhaps.
And I think one of the things that happens precisely because the way of the colonial nature of a lot of this in non-European contexts is that the movement to maintain the old ways, or the movement for kind of liberation from the kind of desacralized Western order, it manifests as a left-wing movement, whereas in the West right now, the resistance is a right-wing movement, and that those interact differently, co-opted differently. They co-opt and interact with religious movements differently, generally speaking, which I think is perhaps a confounding aspect to the political.
Yeah. We don't have time to really embark on a discussion of chapter 5, but I do want to mention it just because it was I think of all the chapters of this book, it probably, to me, had the most meat to it. It was the only one that I really wanted to read a second time. It's the chapter is titled, let's see, Art, Technology, and the Sacred. And just to quickly explain it basically, his thesis is that science cannot create an image of itself. Science cannot express itself. And so basically, or it can't express itself in a way that is kind of adequate to the spiritual realities of the universe.
To the complete, so that to complete humanity in a completely human way.
Exactly. So that art, it's part of one role that art needs to serve is to serve as a means of expression for science that would open it to the sacred. He says this. I like what he says about that science really should have more potential for sacrality than kind of a scientific culture should have more potential for that than a primitive culture that doesn't understand much about how the natural world works.
Yes, because that cuts very much against the grain. Because the modern idea is that the idiots of thousands of years ago couldn't, because they didn't have Galileo or whatever. Of course, they just turned the sun into a source of meaning rather than a source of ions or whatever, and I think it was very optimistic, but in this case, potentially very meaningfully and I think very potentially, very helpfully so, that, seeing the sun as an ongoing nuclear reaction doesn't have to. We've been catechized to believe that basically has to wipe away the sacred quality, but it could enhance it. And
Right.
I think that's very helpful. Not that I expect that to happen in my lifetime in a broad civilizational way, but I think it's very helpful for us as Catholics to see that and say, we don't have to accept the narrative that the sun is either, or that the natural world generally, the cosmos generally, is either a what science says it is, or full of sacred cosmological meaning. It can be both, and in fact, the scientific can enhance the sacred, and that I think is very beautiful. It's very beautiful, and also, and you're going to get to this. I don't want to step on your toes, but that art can be a way of expressing that. I thought it was very, very cool.
Yeah, I think so too. And I'll be honest, it's not something that I've given a lot of thought to. I'm a musician too, so that I deal with images in a less concrete way than any other art form.
Sure.
So I'm not portraying anything. I think what I'm doing is something a little bit more abstracted. That's how I think of it anyway. Sure. But it is interesting where he also connects it to the way that artists use technology, and he says that art should not merely be kind of like a record of the technological development of its time. It shouldn't just be kind of led by the nose or something by technology, but that I think that he says that artists today lack ambition. That I'm paraphrasing.
I think he uses that exact word.
They've allowed themselves to be dazzled and enslaved by technology instead of kind of again giving a more spiritual sense and a more spiritual use, and even perhaps leading technological development in a more human direction. Yeah,
there's a kind of, he describes it an integral kind of deeply humanistic. I mean that in the most comprehensive sense, to include the divine, to include our supernatural nature. He gives us a really beautiful account of what is possible, of the kind of science and art and technology all working together to build up a civilization, and that this requires Christianity, and that this is where he's kind of at his where he's at his best. I think it requires the sacred. So that the sacred, the artistic, the technological, the scientific, these all build each other up. And I think it's great. And I think as you were talking about music, I was thinking a little bit as I read, and I'm not an artist in any meaningful sense. But I was thinking about how still image feels, I guess, not up to the task today. I think film, while it's getting played out, still has an ability to. I think cinema has an ability to get at these things that, while it's being kind of suppressed now by CGI and everything, I think there's possibilities there. People have very strong opinions about Terrence Malick, but
I love Terrence Malick.
Yeah, I think of the opening sequence in Tree of Life, where he not the opening, but the big formation of the universe scene, where he has actual images of space and of the creation of galaxies, basically, of the creation of and then also a lot of the other imagery he uses is this dinosaur stuff CGI. The dinosaur stuff's weird, but before the dinosaur stuff, all the creation of life images were created by people and were filmed on film. They were not just created on they're not digital images.
Right.
And
he's using chemicals.
Right. Exactly.
Kind of.
And then you have these images of space that are meant to evoke creation, and layered on top of that is, Preissner's Lacrimosa, a modern requiem. The first time I saw that combination of image and sound, I've never felt like it before. I honestly, in the aftermath, I was not sure if I breathed for, two good minutes.
Wow.
And it was incredibly striking and moving and transporting in the traditional sense of that word, That's possible. It's possible to, in that moment, and ever since, when I see that and when I think about that, that combination, that art made the cosmos as a scientific reality feel like a spiritual reality, because it is spiritual reality, but it accomplished that in a way that you can't abstractly. You need something to interact with. You need something to the senses to take in to help you.
Yeah.
That I think is a great example.
I that is a great example. I've only seen that film once, but I totally agree with you. And as a musician, again, I think that this science, allowing science to give expression to itself, probably is more the domain of the visual arts and the narrative arts. But I will say I do relate to what he was talking about with art and technology. I think that music, probably of all the art forms, I think easily of all the art forms, music is the one that has been the most essentially replaced by technology. The human element has been essentially replaced by technology. And so I think not so much in what it's portraying, but in the process of its creation and in the end product itself, I think that musicians ought to be at the very least giving an example in their work of how these new technologies can be incorporated in what is essentially still a human process and what is essentially still a human product. Yeah. So I think that would be that's where this takes me. But I think that music is always sort of more self-contained and less outwardly referential.
Right.
I mean, speaking of instrumental music at the very least. And so I think that it is kind of, it's always going to be more of an analog to everything else than it is to be like a direct expression in the way that a painting or a film would be.
Yeah. I think music certainly has a lot to say. I think that, and this is where I kind of get to film the interaction of music with image.
Right. And it acquires a whole new potency and a whole new potential for meaning in a specific way when combined with other art forms.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's kind of cliche to say it, but we are living in an era of really bad art. I mean, and it's just something that is whatever the opposite of elevating is. It is depressing. It keeps us down. It keeps us from contemplating anything beyond, the latest NFL scores or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, I follow hockey this time of year, but my Penguins lost. But it's very, especially in the past year when we've all been locked inside or whatever, or something close to it. I'm exaggerating a little bit. In some cases, I suppose not. But out of crisis, you're supposed to get good art at least,
Mm-hmm.
out of, and yeah, what do we have? Well, we have pornography.
But do you if it's a self-imposed crisis?
Well, yeah, well, maybe there's I mean, I don't know. Shouldn't there be angry art? I don't know. Angry art can be good art, but I don't know. I think. I mean, but what do we have? What have people kept themselves busy with? What has this time gone to when it comes to, the kind of talk about time. It's all kinds of time on our hands for contemplation. What do we contemplate? We contemplated pornography. I mean, like, this is where I just get upset with his optimism, because I was like, sorry, bud, it didn't work out. I mean, but it's very it's just. Yeah, it's depressing. But
if people want to learn more about how film can, contribute to a truly humane and religious vision of the world, they should check out our other podcast, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, where we will certainly be talking about Malick eventually. Wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah.
Brandon, what just by way of closing, going back to the title chapter. This is something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about. So, what would be like on a practical level? What would be a suggestion that you would have that would be, let's say, like not with a million preconditions to implement? What would be something that, if we simply had the will, could implement today as a society, as a state, to solve this political problem of prayer?
Yeah, I mean. Right now, I think that policies that make it possible for more possible for families to be together and to have time that's not being grabbed by the economy, possibilities for it's so hard to think because. We've moved so far down the line. Yeah, I think that I think that it is possible in the here and now for policies to expand the time and space for sacredness. An example that may seem far-fetched, that should not be far-fetched, but that is absolutely true, that can start in the family but should build up to the social level, is to recapture the Lord's Day. That I think is a classic example, and it has to be because you're not going to get the reinstating of blue laws probably at the state level anytime soon. But the family can not just go to mass, but keep that day sacred in other days. Can try not to do any kind of non-essential shopping. Can try to avoid. Can try to avoid unnecessary labor, and that can build up into communities where Sundays are held more and more sacred, and to the extent that it's possible in local communities, perhaps agitate for some kind of state official recognition of that. But that's the best example, and that is what I talked about back in that blog post a while back, and that's something I think that if there is a low-hanging fruit for us, that may be it.
Great. Yeah. I mean, here we go back to also, we can go back to the problem, the statement by Danielou, which we took issue with earlier, which is that, talking about the state cutting out dead wood and religious traditions, not that part, but, the part where he says, if religions demand of the state that it make a life of prayer possible, the state may demand of religions that they make it a reality. So whatever the state is or isn't doing, it's on us who are discussing this problem to actually implement these things in our lives, because we're going to make it's our own prayer that it's going to make it possible for others to pray as well. And it ultimately comes down to each of us individually and as families.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't want to make it too individual, but you're right that we are in the situation that Danielou did not want to come to pass, where it is where the faith is really largely available to and practiced by, I don't want to say an elite, it's not like we're some sort of heroes or anything, but people who have been schooled in the faith, have schooled themselves in the faith, have been lucky to find themselves in very strong communities, but it's not passed down in that kind of genetic way. And so that means we're now in a situation where we have to be thinking, on the one hand, about how do we live in the situation we're in, but also how do we do the little things that build up the kind of momentum that in generations and generations from now can be looked at as the seeds of a new civilization. And that means, clawing back the Lord's Day, family by family, neighborhood by neighborhood, parish by parish, diocese by diocese.
Yep. And yes, indeed. Well, thank you, Brandon. This was fun.
Yeah, this is great.
Good discussion.
I like doing it this hour too. I'm kind of a night owl, so this works for me.
Yeah, same. So, so the book again, Prayer is a Political Problem, published by Cluny Media. I'll link to it, and I'll also link to your new piece with Scott Hahn.
Yeah.
And thanks a lot, Brandon. I'm going to ask people to subscribe if they're watching this on YouTube and they like this video. And also please consider throwing us a donation. You can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. And thank you all for listening.